2 years ago, Tom Powers approached me with the idea of coming out with an updated version on the Allegheny Arsenal. And Tom and I, in the past, co-authored articles and collaborated on joint lectures, but we never worked together on a book. Tom is an avid researcher and a great illustrator. At first, the idea seemed very simple. We would take my existing book, add the materials that I have discovered in the last 20 years, add Tom's research that he did on the subject, throw in some illustrations, and in about 7 months we could have a 150-page book ready for publication. Well, it didn't work out that way. When we started delving into the subject, that was when we realized there was more to the history. And the more that we began to delve into it, the more we realized that a tremendous amount of history was totally overlooked. Now, historians researching the Allegheny Arsenal generally focus on the tremendous explosion, the disastrous explosion of September 17th, 1862. And all the reports that I have read on it examine the coroner's inquest. Yet there was so much more of the history prior to the Civil War, and there was a tremendous amount of history during the Civil War as well as afterwards that was never covered, or like I said, just covered briefly in my original book. So Tom and I went out in search of that lost history. The book that we have produced now stands about 340 pages and will be the most comprehensive examination of the Allegheny Arsenal and the evolution of its grounds. On this slide, we refer to the Forgotten Landmark. On the left, you will see Pittsburgh's Forgotten Allegheny Arsenal, the book, and a picture of the gatehouse. On the right, we are going to honor and acknowledge in this book a number of local people who made valuable contributions to preserve our heritage. One man was Joe Borkowski, and here you see him trying to save the stones from the demolished gatehouse of the Allegheny Arsenal. Tom?
Okay, so again, this is, for the most part, we're sort of working on new ground here, this lost history. It comes in bits and pieces, but we've been able to cobble it together into a hopefully coherent book. We start out again looking for any pictures, illustrations we can on the arsenal, and in fact the one you're showing here, many of you have maybe seen this on our website. We did an article in our newsletter on it, but this is probably the oldest picture of the Allegheny Arsenal, and in fact might be the oldest picture of anything in Lawrenceville. It's I can date it to about 1868, just after the Civil War, and it is a part of a series of photographs taken by William T. Purviance for the Pennsylvania Central Railroad. He did a series, one of which I was able to date this by was of the original Sharpsburg Bridge, which is now the Robert V. Fleming Bridge, the 62nd Street Bridge. The version that he photographed I knew burned down in 1870. So since he originated in this area, later moved to Philadelphia, I'm pretty sure that the 1868 date on this photograph is probably correct. So to build an arsenal, well, you got to get started with the building materials, and this ad that we see here, and it's dated from Fort Fayette, which is where the military was working from. That's now where the convention, that was where the convention center now is, on 9th and Penn. And they called out for stonemasons in August of 1814. What the stonemasons would erect initially would be this structure. The very first building on the Allegheny Arsenal was the storehouse, which would make sense. And it wasn't until just earlier this year that I was able to locate this detail from an 1815 map of the area. And where it shows the Ordnance Depot right here, there's only one little structure which my red arrow points to, and that's this storehouse. And I know it's that storehouse because of its position and the angle that it's at, as opposed to the grid pattern that the streets form here. The one surprise on this map is this stream here. This stream actually emanates from up around Penn Avenue and was probably used as water supply for the arsenal. But in this case, the stream went right by this building here, and they probably positioned the building to make use of the stream for dumping off supplies to the storehouse by boat. Later, this would be done away with, but just to give you a better view of, the positioning of the storehouse, I'm going to pop up this 1835 map, and I'm going to blow it up just a little bit here. Here's the storehouse, and again, and you can see it's at this angle, different from everything else that's being built in the arsenal. The stream, for the most part, is gone, except for it is slightly indicated here on Washington Street, which is now Willow Street, or yeah, it's Willow, and it all of a sudden abruptly ends when it hits Covington Street, which is now 40th Street, Pike Street being 39th Street. So this is again why this sort of eccentric positioning here was caused by this unnamed stream that used to go through the arsenal. Oh, I should also mention that nobody realized, including us. I mean, I had guessed that this was probably the first building, but I didn't have any proof until I found this map. But this building actually probably lasted up until 1970, when it was torn down as maybe being too old or whatever. And it's unfortunate because historically, now that we know what and when it was built, now we know that this was the very first arsenal building, unfortunately, unceremoniously torn down in the early 70s. Let's go. Another interesting aspect, again, in the book we'll have a whole list of the arsenal commandants, and one interesting one was this fellow who was commandant when Lafayette visited the arsenal, to get a sense of the military as it was working during that period. And one thing we should also mention that people don't realize is that the main attraction in Pittsburgh, at least before the Civil War in the antebellum period, the biggest attraction would have been the Allegheny Arsenal. It was the only vestige of the federal government, a military base, and when visitors came, including President James Monroe, they wanted to see the arsenal. Well, this fellow was the commander at that time, and the interesting thing about him is that his face might look a little bit familiar to you, and there's a good reason for that, because his name was Major Sylvester Churchill, and you can see the facial resemblance between he and Winston Churchill. There was a branch of the Churchill family that came to America in the 1640s, and we're pretty sure that this fellow is a relative, if not just by the way he looks. This photograph was pointed out to Franklin Roosevelt by the wife of the Swiss ambassador. Her name was Annie Coleman Harrison, Coleman being her maiden name. She was the granddaughter of Sylvester Churchill, and she had this painting, only we have a black and white copy of it. She had this painting hanging in her house and sent it to Roosevelt saying, your friend Winston might be interested in seeing the family resemblance here, which he was, and wrote a nice letter back to Roosevelt, and presumably also to Miss Harrison as well. So again, that's just one of the interesting people that ran the arsenal. Another interesting person that actually for a short period of time was an arsenal commandant was a fellow named Thomas Rodman. And he is best known as the inventor of one of the largest pieces of artillery in the 19th century that was manufactured here in Pittsburgh. And it was so world renowned that Jules Verne actually used it as the basis for the model of the piece of artillery that was used in the story of From the Earth to the Moon. This is the copy of the title page of the French version, and here it's La Colombe de Rodmar. Didn't quite get the spelling right, but and also they didn't get the illustration right. The Rodman gun is a smoothbore, as seen in this picture from the replica that's in the Heinz History Center. And Jim can tell us a little bit more about Thomas Rodman.
Well, Rodman was one of those men that kept being bounced around all over the country. Anywhere the military needed him, they sent him. And he's not only an expert in casting large artillery pieces, he also developed cake gunpowder and a bullet making machine. Now before, if you wanted to cast a bullet, you literally had to pour some lead into a mold, let it cool, and he made bullets one at a time. He came up with a machine that would take a strip of lead, almost like a belt, put it inside a machine, and when you cranked it, out would come a bullet head. And that was quite revolutionary, because as fast as you could crank, now you could produce bullets. Another unique factor about Rodman is the fact that it was not until the end of his military career that the Ordnance Department recognized his valuable contributions. In a single day, the military gave him a series of promotions that took him from the rank of major all the way up to brigadier general. As Tom said, we're putting in a lot of little sideline stories because we became interested in some of the people that worked at the arsenal, either in the military or were civilian workers. And we tried to find out what happened to some of these people. And I think one of the people that really are interesting is Josiah Gorgas. He was stationed at the Allegheny Arsenal in 1851, and on the left you see him in his Union uniform. He had a terrible temper. He couldn't get along with anybody. But he was a very capable administrator and rather inventive man. But again, his temper stood in the way of him receiving any kind of promotions. When the Civil War broke out, he sought a series of advancements that would give him a position of more authority. In each case, the federal government turned him down. So he crossed the border and went over to the Confederacy. And on the right, you see him in his Confederate uniform. He went to President Jefferson Davis and offered his services to be Chief of Ordnance for the Confederacy. At first, Jefferson Davis did not want to have anything to do with Gorgas because he had his own select candidates. Well, unfortunately for Davis, all his candidates turned him down. So, since nobody wanted the job, he turned to Josiah Gorgas and said, "It's yours." At the end of the American Civil War, Lee ran out of men and food, but he never ran out of guns and ammunition. As a matter of fact, when Richmond fell, they were destroying warehouses and train car loads of ammunition so they would not fall into the hands of the Union Army. And why? It was all because of Josiah Gorgas's abilities to have the Confederacy produce so many war materials. Most of you may be familiar with the story of an incident that took place in December 1860 when Secretary of War John Floyd ordered the transfer of 124 large cannon to be removed from the Allegheny Arsenal and shipped to southern forts that were still under construction in Mississippi and Texas. What most people are not familiar with is what was happening behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. When Russell, Majors, and Waddell needed payment for their services as freight haulers for the federal government in our war with the Mormons, they needed the money because they wanted to organize the Pony Express. And the Treasury was very slow in paying them. So Majors went to Floyd and says, "How about get me some help in getting payment for what is due my company?" When Congress was delaying on the releasing of the funds, a man by the name of Goddard Bailey, who was a distant relation to John Floyd, came up with the scheme of letting Majors have some bonds that were held in trust for the Native American Indians. The scheme seemed very simple. Majors would take these bonds to a bank, say, "Here's your collateral." As soon as he was paid, they would put the bonds back in the safe. Well, no bank would accept these bonds. So Majors decides to start selling them on the open market at an extremely discounted rate. Well, the president, James Buchanan, was extremely embarrassed when the scandal broke because his own personal bankers happened to buy some of these stolen bonds for the president's portfolio. Our next slide, we like to call these the bad boys of the Allegheny Arsenal. In October 1861, matches were found around gunpowder. The newspapers were livid that Major John Symington, commander of the Allegheny Arsenal at the time, was not doing anything about it. And the people of Lawrenceville and Pittsburgh were terrified that some explosion would take place and wipe out the entire community. When the culprits could not be identified, John Symington fired 200 boys. The same newspapers that criticized Symington for lack of activity and lack of discipline were now accusing him of an arbitrary display of wanton power. I mean, John Symington just can't win with the newspapers. So he replaced the boys with girls who were believed to be more reliable, more dexterous, and didn't smoke. So that eliminated the problem of matches around gunpowder.
Now we get into the probably the best known story about the Allegheny Arsenal, and we're not going to give you too much on it other than that there was a series of 3 explosions at the arsenal, mainly in the main laboratory area, and we've again discussed this many times before in articles. And also we have a separate lecture on that because it's so involved that it takes a whole hour lecture to talk about it. But what we want to show you is one of the actually the finds that I came across as we were doing the research, and that is the photo that you see on the right here. again, we featured this in our newsletter, but this is a photo of Fridolina Neckerman. Her father, Michael Neckerman, was a mechanic at the machine shop at the Arsenal, and later became head of the machine shop. But in between time, or about this time in 1862, he got his daughter a job at the in the laboratory loading cartridges. Fridolina also went by the name of just Lena and Melinda. Maybe again the Fridolina name was a little bit too Germanic for her, and so on the memorial stone she's listed as Melinda. But this photo was found through Ancestry.com. I basically started wondering if we could find any photographs of the victims of the explosion, and I just loaded in to find anybody with a death date of September 17th, 1862, and Fridolina showed up. She's from a site that is from a relative, a guy's name's Ryan Conley, and he is a direct descendant of the Neckermans. He had this on his site, and so far this is the only image of one of the 71 girls, actually and the total of 78 victims. This is the only picture of one of them that we have from her, and that comes courtesy through the Neckerman family. Michael Neckerman also wrote a brief 5-page autobiography, which was also very useful in fleshing out the story.
Tom, before you change the slide, I'd like to point out to everybody that earlier I said that Arsenal historians study the explosion strictly from the accounts that appeared in the newspaper of the coroner's inquest. What makes our book different is that we also ran down the military inquest into the explosion and transcribed 100 handwritten pages and took our extracts from that document.
Now the other thing that we want to focus on, another discovery, and I should also mention the one advantage we have in doing this research nowadays is newspapers.com. When you can word search over thousands and thousands of newspapers, that is a huge tool that allows us to come up with little discoveries like this. And the wagon driver, Joseph R. Frick, was sort of lost to history after he was blown out of the wagon. He, of course, survives. Until a reporter for the Pittsburgh Commercial Gazette came to his door on Cliff Street, which is still there in the Lower Hill district, came to his door inquiring about an explosion he heard about in the house. It turns out that young Clara Frick was trying to dampen a fire with what's called slack, which is essentially coal dust, throwing it on the fire to dampen it down. Well, unfortunately, when she was shoveling that slack onto the fire, there was a little bit of gunpowder that got into the slack, and it blew up on her. She had injuries, but she survived. And when the reporter came to the door and questioned her father, Joseph Frick mentioned, "Well, I know a little bit about surviving explosions." And he went on to recount the fact that he was the guy in the wagon that was blown out in the initial explosion at the Arsenal. It turns out that Frick was quite an entrepreneur. He had worked in the oil fields prior to the Civil War and afterwards. The wagon he drove was the wagon he owned. Normally he would have had another man driving it for him, but that man called in, didn't show up, so Frick had to drive the wagon himself, and found himself in history unexpectedly. But Frick also, interestingly, founded another business that was based up in Bloomfield, and that was as a purveyor of lightning rods. Apparently he had patented a special lightning rod that they were selling out of this office on Liberty Avenue. So again, he also went on after this business sort of petered out. He went into real estate and had quite a thriving business at the time of his death in 1902. Now, the question arose after the Civil War, do we really need an arsenal in Pittsburgh? The South had been subdued. There's no, Native Americans knocking on the door anymore. Why do we have? And we aren't planning to invade Canada like we were in 1812. So why do we need this? Well, that question was brought up by one General James Scott Negley, and if that name sounds familiar, it is. He's part of the Negley family. However, his parents died when he was very young, and he was taken in by another familiar Pittsburgh name, the Baum family, from Baum Boulevard. And he grew up, and again, interested in the military as well as horticulture. But he was associated with the Duquesne Greys and was a non-commissioned officer during the Mexican War, but kept up with the Greys. It's sort of a local militia group that, the country was filled with people who like to dress up and drill on the weekends and so forth. He was heavily involved with that, so by the time the Civil War came around, he had actually helped raise a company that he was soon put in charge of, rising to the rank of general. He had a checkered career in the military. He was had a great success at the Battle of Chattanooga, where he showed that the Union Army could penetrate deep into the South. But he also had a bad outing in Chickamauga, where his army was routed, and he was given blame for the defeat thereof. And what that left him with was a strong dislike for anybody that graduated from West Point. And oddly enough, the people that were running the Allegheny Arsenal from the 1830s on up were usually or mostly West Point graduates. So there might have been a little animosity there. At the end of 1870, as a U.S. representative from the North Side, Negley proposed abandoning the arsenal, to which caused a great consternation, especially from the commander at the time, Robert Whiteley. Again, and most of Pittsburgh was, soundly against this proposal. Again, it took away what was one of the main attractions of the city at the time, but maybe an unnecessary one. Later Commandant, James Riley, also wrote sort of a stirring defense of the arsenal. The map that you see there was a detail from an 1875 ordnance report that studied what the layout of the arsenal to explain what's there and what would need to be disposed of. But the arsenal hung on, through Negley's term as a U.S. representative. Now, there was a second armaments genius on the level of Thomas Rodman, and Jim's going to tell us a little bit about him.
Well, our story starts in July 1877. There was a terrible railroad strike. The state militia was called in basically to be strike breakers. And they went down to 28th Street to the depot, confronted the strikers, and it turned into an all-day, all-night gun battle. The militia fled, and they tried to seek sanctuary at the Allegheny Arsenal. He was commander at the time, but Major Adelbert R. Buffington. And Buffington told them that he was not going to allow them into the arsenal, but he would treat the wounded from both sides if the rioters would spare the arsenal. Eventually, Buffington would receive criticism for this, but I think in fairness to Buffington, he had such a very small force that it would have been impossible for him to protect all the grounds of the Allegheny Arsenal if he engaged in a major all-out fight with the thousands of strikers and rioters. It's interesting to note that his military career is not tarnished by refusing the militia sanctuary. In fact, he's responsible for a number of important military contributions. These included being the co-inventor of the Buffington Crozier disappearing carriage for coastal defense guns, which was widely used in the country between 1895 and 1917. He also made dramatic changes to the 1884 Springfield trapful rifle. He invented a magazine firearm, a rod bayonet, and a rear sight for military firearms. So you can see he's quite a genius when it comes to inventing or perfecting weaponry. In 1899, he was appointed the Chief of Ordnance and was raised to the rank of Brigadier General.
Yeah, just to explain this illustration a little bit, and again, you can see how complicated this device is, but basically it allowed for the recoil of the gun to take it all the way flat through this giant hinge, and it could be reloaded from ground level and then popped back up, cranked back up just over the wall in on this coastal defense. So quite an ingenious contraption. Now, since we're talking about cannons, I came across this other newspaper story about the sort of war souvenirs that the Arsenal had collected, not only from the Civil War, but prior to the Civil War. They had a lot of Revolutionary War armaments in there, some of which you can still see on the 5th floor of the Heinz History Center. There are three relatively small cannons there, which used to be on a memorial fountain in the center of the arsenal. But one of the cannon, which was actually out front, as we see in this picture, although I can't positively identify it, but it was labeled El Desperado, and it dates from the mid-1700s. It was captured from the Spanish in Florida, and we can date it because the inscription on it talks about Charles III, the King of Spain, and the Indies. Now, continuing with our cannons, in 1894, the Grand Army of the Republic, also abbreviated as the GAR, held a convention, or what they call an encampment, here in Pittsburgh, and it was a big affair that generated a lot of publicity and a lot of materials. And one of the materials it generated were souvenir badges that were made from a cannon that the Arsenal had given over to the GAR to be melted down into badges, and also melted down into a reconstruction miniature version of the cannon, which has been sitting in Soldiers and Sailors Hall, since 1908, when the committee handed it over to the newly built structure. we see actually the curator of the Soldiers and Sailors, Mike Krause here, giving some scale to the miniature gun. And it was interesting. I actually did a whole story on this. It was in the Western Pennsylvania History magazine. Is that Mike and anyone associated with Soldiers and Sailors had no idea where this miniature cannon came from until I found that story on it. Now we also have something that sounds like it could be ripped from today's headlines, and that is a criminal being shot on the grounds of the Allegheny Arsenal, or unfortunately just outside the grounds. Starting in 1901, 1902, it looked like the arsenal was finally going to be decommissioned, and consequently a lot of those cannons and war souvenirs were being shipped off to other museums, and again just taken away from the arsenal collection to make either to prepare for it to be torn down or to put to be some other use, which it was, and which we'll talk about in a second. But during that period, a lot of local thieves were eyeing the copper sheathing that was on the top of the buildings. And if any of you are plumbers or know plumbers that have to deal with stolen copper pipe, it's the same thing. It can be easily melted and resold, and that's what was happening at the arsenal. Well, the commandant at the time, Lieutenant Ralph Drury, decided he had enough of this, and he brought out a detail when he learned that people were on the roof and tearing off some of the roofing, the copper sheathing off the roofs. So he brought a detail out, and they shooed away several looters, and one of the guards, the Private John Dowd, cornered one who immediately started to run across the rail yard that was outside the arsenal, called him to stop, and when he didn't, he shot him. Dowd, who just came fresh from the Philippines, was definitely a good shot, because he shot the victim, Bill Crowley, in the leg. Unfortunately, he evidently hit an artery, and Crowley started to bleed uncontrollably. So by the time they got him up to West Penn Hospital, he had expired. Well, this caused an uproar because the shooting took place outside the arsenal grounds. A military court-martial reviewed the case in 1903, and they found both Drury and Dowd innocent and justified in the shooting. But that didn't satisfy the local authorities, and they did a civil trial, which after a couple years of arguing about who had jurisdiction over it, took place in 1907. And again, Drury and Dowd were acquitted, but they had to stay at the arsenal, for those almost 3.5 years until they were finally acquitted in the civil trial. So it was quite a headline-making story at the time. Now, Jim's going to tell you about the visit of William Taft to the arsenal.
It was May 29th, 1909. Arsenal Park was packed with 10,000 spectators who came to see the President of the United States, William Howard Taft. The President dedicated the Dolly Madison Fountain. That same day, he was also at the dedication of Rudolph Shalom Synagogue in Shadyside, and he attended a baseball game. And if you ever do make it out to Rudolph Shalom, they do have a big plaque honoring President Taft for his role in the dedication of that synagogue.
Now, speaking of Arsenal Park, that has an interesting history, of which I'm going to touch on very briefly here. And before I get into that, I have to thank Andrea Ketzel of the Pittsburgh Department of Public Works, who emailed me several of the maps and designs we're going to see here. Well, more than we're going to see here. But it also draws our attention to the current design of the park, which was supervised by Ralph Griswold. He was director of parks from 1934 and 1945, and he played a large role in revitalizing the park, not only Arsenal Park, but the other parks within the Pittsburgh system. And in fact, Griswold sort of campaigned for that role, in that he noticed that nothing was being done with the Pittsburgh parks, put forth a plan to a committee, and they said, okay, if this sounds good, why don't you do something? And so he got together a team of more than probably out of work draftsmen and architects, landscape architects, and they proceeded to produce plans for the revitalization of the parks. And of course, the one that we're looking up here is the Arsenal Park plan, which is pretty much what we see today. And again, Griswold was supervising this. And to let you know what other work he did, he was part of the team, along with architect Charles Stotts, that designed and literally created Point State Park. A very difficult job, which entailed tearing down 2 bridges, putting up 2 new bridges, and rerouting the whole highway system around the Pittsburgh's Point. There's a very good book about the subject that talks about this, that shows what a difficult job that was. But that wasn't the first difficult job Mr. Griswold took. And in fact, this photo comes from the Bulletin Index magazine, which in 1936 called Griswold the Man of the Year for his revitalization of the Pittsburgh's parks. And one of the points, and actually I'm going to back up here, this point right here, just off 39th Street, was to be the position for the rebuilt Arsenal Gatehouse. This plan is drawn up in 1937, and the old gatehouse would have been reassembled with a office space on the left side and restrooms where the old fire engine garage was, with a little club space up on top. And it would have been a great addition to the park, but the whole thing stalled because it's in the middle of a depression. The WPA type money from the government was running out, and it just stalled. They had actually signed off on it in 1943, but it just never got the funding that it deserved, and consequently, as you recall the picture that we showed in the beginning here with Joe Borkowski standing around the blocks of the Arsenal Gatehouse, it never came to fruition.
In 1908, Congress designated funds for the United States Geological Survey to investigate mine explosions. And at the time, Joseph Austin Holmes, who you see at the bottom left, he had extensive experience in testing fuels and structural materials, and was the chief of the United States Geological Survey's testing laboratories. Well, Holmes moved to Pittsburgh in 1908 to establish laboratories at the Pittsburgh Arsenal in Lawrenceville. In many respects, the grounds of the Allegheny Arsenal became the birthplace for the United States Bureau of Mines. Now, while most people are acquainted with the deadly Civil War explosion at the Allegheny Arsenal in 1862, the Warren Evening Mirror, Tuesday, December 8, 1908, sheds light on another explosion that rocked the grounds. This is in reference to a test conducted by Joseph Holmes. I quote, When 25 United States government officials tried a test at the Allegheny Arsenal in Lawrenceville with an extra heavy charge in gas and dust gallery number 1, residents of Lawrenceville had visions of another Arsenal explosion. Besides throwing that portion of the population between the forks of the road and 48th Street into hysterics, the extra charge shattered more than 200 windows and broke nearly all the electric globes in the Arsenal grounds. Gallery number 1 is a mammoth steel tube, 100 feet long and almost 6.5 feet in diameter, containing 15 sections of boilerplate steel. An extra heavy charge of coal dust and a large percentage of methane and ethane gas were combined and exploded in the gallery. The force of the explosion was so great as to release the entire 15 pressure doors. No one in the testing party was injured, but the force of the explosion shook dwellings within 2 miles.
Now, actually, before we go on to the next slide, I want to just point out real quick, just to get you oriented here, this building right here is the original storehouse, converted into experimentation building for the Bureau of Mines. These buildings here are the old mechanics building, and this was the old engine house. If we were to look at this today, the 40th Street Bridge would be right in this area here, actually cutting through these buildings. The bottom photo also shows the gatehouse right here, and this is the old armory, which is blown up in 1918.
Okay, next topic we wanted to take a look at in the book was the United States Marine Hospital. After much bickering on the federal level, 5 acres of land on the grounds of the United States Arsenal were transferred from the United States military to the Treasury Department. These grounds were near Penn Avenue. The new United States Merchant Marine Hospital was opened October 22, 1910. The facility treated disabled seamen who worked on our lakes, rivers, seas, and coastlands. The 4-story building had beds for 73 patients. The facilities were closed in 1949, and the property was transferred to the city of Pittsburgh. Here's an illustration that we are including in the book, and it gives you an idea of what each of the 8 buildings on the former grounds of the U.S. Marine Hospital were. Well, actually, one building was opened in 2009. But it gives you a good feel for history of the period about 1910 to 1934, how the grounds would have looked. Now, this is the Frank B. Clack Health Center. From 1950 to 1959, the former Marine Hospital became the Arsenal Health Center, City of Pittsburgh. Then from 1959 to 1979, it became the Arsenal Health Center, Allegheny County. Its last name change was in 1979 to the Frank B. Clack Health Center. Frank Clack was the first person who did not hold a medical doctor's degree to run a county health department. He was a doctor of veterinary medicine. It actually took an act of the state legislature to allow Clack to assume that $40,000 a year position.
Now, one of the buildings of note is probably Allegheny County's oldest municipal building, and that is this old brick powder magazine, which is now the Clack Center's carpentry shop. And the inside view of that shop shows the vaulted ceilings, again designed to mitigate gunpowder blast. But this building is solidly built, has 3 to 6 foot thick walls, and it would be a shame. Again, currently they're talking about selling this property off, and it would be a real shame if this thing was destroyed, as this is again one of the older buildings in existence from the Arsenal. So we got our fingers crossed that that's not going to happen, but these days you never know. I also want to point out another feature that everybody in Lawrenceville is familiar with, and that is it's now the Arsenal Middle School, but in 1932 it started out as the Arsenal High School. This replaced several other buildings, one a trade school, and which was incorporated into the Washington Trade School. But without going into that long history, I just wanted to call your attention to an interesting aspect of this building. And you'll note that today there's another wing here, which is the Arsenal Elementary School. That wasn't built until 1939. But the interesting feature of this is this long patio space that goes from one end to the other. And the reason for that patio space is that one of the buildings that this school replaced was the Arsenal Open Air School. And open air schools were in vogue around the turn of the century to, again, mitigate children from the ravages of tuberculosis. And the theory was that being in the open air would help delay or stop the onslaught of that disease. So this long porch is still in existence, and it goes between this wing and the other wing. But that's a reason that not many people realize why that big porch is there. It was for the open air school. One other thing that's going to be hard to see on here, but I'm going to sort of go around it here. There's this huge flagpole. This was erected in 1908 by the Carnegie Company, and I don't know exactly, it's hard to guess how high this thing was, but it was really high. And unfortunately, for us, it's still in existence, but it was moved elsewhere in the park, cut down. But the flagpole that you see when you enter Arsenal Park these days is that flagpole from the Carnegie Company, and it is be now about 113 years old, but it's still in existence, but in a shortened form.
As we begin to wrap up the book, we talk about the 2012 Remembrance. In 2012, the Lawrenceville Historical Society worked in conjunction with the Sons of the Union Veterans, the Allegheny Cemetery Historical Association, and the Senator John Heinz History Center for a series of commemorative events to honor the 150th anniversary of the disastrous explosion of 1862, which claimed the lives of 78 persons. Events in the park included lectures, firing of historic cannon, musical presentations, and a demonstration to show the difference between black gunpowder and modern powder. At the Senator John Heinz History Center, there was a lecture which both Tom and I were invited to present on the history of the Allegheny Arsenal in concentration on the explosion. And then later, CEO and President Andy Masick, whom you see seated there on the top picture, he arranged to have the noted forensic expert Cyril Wecht convene a panel of Civil War experts to determine the cause of the deadly explosion of 1862. A number of Lawrenceville Historical Society members participated in that event. They either gave testimony or served on the jury. The event made 9 local papers, such as the Bulletin, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Pittsburgh Catholic, and the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, but the story was actually carried by the Associated Press, and it appeared in more than 15 major newspapers across the country. After 150 years, the victims of that appalling disaster were finally acknowledged for their ultimate sacrifice to their country. Now, I'd like to get to the last slide, which is, again, a reference to the Allegheny Arsenal Handbook. And I'd like to say that, as you can see, there's a lot more to the Allegheny Arsenal story than just the explosion. We assure you that the Allegheny Arsenal Handbook will contain many, many stories about the people and events that shaped our heritage. Both Tom and I look forward to the completion of this project. Moreover, we look forward to the day when we can get together in person, as we have in the past with our public meetings, and hopefully this coming spring of 2022, there will be a special event for the unveiling of the book highlighting Lawrenceville's most important landmark. So, be on the lookout for future announcements relating to this event. For your kindness in allowing both Tom and I to be here tonight, we can only say thank you and may God bless all of you.
Okay, well, we went over our time limit there, but as you can see, there's a lot to talk about. I see we got one hand up, so I think, Emily, we can unmute the people, and we'll take some questions here. If there are any, actually, that might just be a thumbs up.
I thought there was one that asked to be unmuted. Slide up a little more.
I have a question
Okay.
for Jim. So the Frick, two questions. Do you relate to Henry Clay, and how did it go from Frick to Frick?
I could barely hear you. Can you repeat that, Emily? Maybe get closer to the mic.
Sorry, Tom. It might be my computer. I said, is Frick any relation to Henry Clay Frick? And
Yeah, actually, there's more to that story, and here's the lowdown. Joseph R. Frick was no relation to Henry Clay Frick, and he also was no relation to another Joseph Frick, who at the time in the 1870s was a well-known anarchist operating out of Pittsburgh. And that might be one of the reasons why Joseph Frick started putting an E on the end of his name. I've seen it indicated in both cases, but for the most part, either spelling is good, and that's the Joseph Frick that got blown out of the wagon, not the Joseph Frick that wanted to blow up a wagon. Again, there's going to be a lot more in this, and this is sort of our first shakedown cruise as far as getting this information out. But as you can see, there's a lot here. We just scratched the surface. Anybody else have a question, either in the chat or want to be unmuted? You seeing anything else, Emily? I'm not.
no, what's that?
Okay, it looks like we left everybody speechless.
No, I have a,
Okay.
in the very first picture of the storehouse, what is the bridge that's in the background?
That's the 40th Street Bridge.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't,
That picture, I didn't say that. That picture was taken in 1934.
Hmm.
The bridge goes up in 1924, and it actually took out, or cut into several of the buildings, which left them almost unusable. But they were actually in use up until the 1960s for the most part.
okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. And we should also mention that next month Jim is going to be back, this time without me interfering, and he's going to talk about the Iron City Brewery from his book, The Goddess of Grain, which you can buy from him. And that we have that's also noted in our newsletter. So if there's nothing else, we thank everybody for coming to hear us speak, and we hope to keep you posted on the progress of our book. We're still looking for printers, and we have to get it proofread. So we're sort of on schedule for next spring. So with that, I think we can end things, and wish everybody a good night.